If insecurity had a sound, it wouldn't be a scream. It would be a quiet alarm that never quite turns off, not loud enough to demand attention, but persistent enough to shape your decisions. Imagine a smoke detector going off in the middle of the night, not because there's a fire, but because it remembers one. The room is calm, the air is clear, yet your body is already standing, already scanning, already bracing. That's how insecurity often lives inside men, not as evidence of danger, but as memory misfiring in the present. Many men were taught, directly or indirectly, that certainty equals worth, that if you hesitate, question yourself, or feel unsettled, something must be wrong with you. So when uncertainty appears, as it inevitably does, you don't read it as a signal. You read it as a verdict. You assume it means you're lacking, behind, or unprepared for life. Over time, this confusion hardens into a persona, the one who must always know, always be composed, always be ahead of the curve. And when that persona cracks, insecurity rushes in to fill the gap. The cost of that misunderstanding is rarely obvious at first. Insecurity doesn't announce itself as self-doubt. It shows up as overthinking attraction, second-guessing ambition, softening boundaries you meant to hold, or betraying yourself in small, reasonable-sounding ways. It influences who you pursue, what you tolerate, and how often you abandon your own signals in favor of approval. Quietly, it narrows your range of choice. It pulls you out of presence and into prediction. And without realizing it, you begin living from reaction rather than authorship. There's an image that captures this dynamic well: a king who keeps reinforcing the castle walls while the real threat lives inside the throne room. From the outside, the kingdom looks secure. Thicker walls, higher towers, more guards. But inside, something is unaddressed. A mistrust, a fracture, a part of the king that never learned how to listen inwardly without panic. So the defenses grow, while the center remains unsettled. Many men do this with their lives. More preparation, more control, more performance. All while the original signal goes untranslated. What insecurity quietly steals is not confidence in the motivational sense. It steals choice. It steals presence. It steals authority over your inner life. When you're governed by an alarm you don't understand, your nervous system makes decisions before you do. You reach, appease, withdraw, or overperform without ever quite choosing. And because it happens internally, it's easy to assume this is just who you are, your temperament, your personality, your fate. There's no need to pathologize this. Insecurity is not proof that something is broken. It's evidence that something learned to protect you early on and hasn't been updated since. It's a signal running on an old map, and like any signal, it carries information. The problem begins when we treat it as an enemy to defeat or a flaw to eliminate, instead of a message to translate. For now, there's nothing to fix and nothing to overcome. Just notice how familiar this feels in your body. The subtle tightening when you're uncertain, the urge to seek reassurance or certainty before acting, the way attention drifts from the present moment toward imagined outcomes. Let that be here without analysis. Let the experience breathe without being judged. Stay with this. Halfway through, we'll expose the pattern most men miss, the one that turns insecurity into a self-feeding loop. And once that pattern becomes visible, the alarm begins to lose its authority, not because it's silenced, but because it's finally understood. There's a moment many men don't talk about because it doesn't fit the narrative they were promised. The promotion arrives, the relationship begins, the external markers line up. From the outside, it looks like momentum, and yet inside something tightens. Instead of relief, there's vigilance. Instead of confidence, there's pressure to maintain. The insecurity doesn't leave. In some cases, it becomes sharper, more articulate, more demanding. This is where insecurity is often mislabeled. It gets called low confidence, imposter syndrome, or a mindset problem. But for many men, the root is older and quieter. It's a hidden wound tied to early attachment, where approval felt conditional or unpredictable. A time when being seen required performing, pleasing, or staying alert to shifts in mood. The nervous system learned a rule early on. Connection must be earned and can be withdrawn without warning. That rule doesn't disappear with adulthood. It waits. Carl Jung used the word shadow to describe the parts of ourselves we disown in order to belong. Not bad parts, just inconvenient ones. Needs, vulnerability, anger, dependency. When those traits don't feel safe to express, they don't vanish. They go underground. And what goes underground doesn't rest. It returns indirectly as anxiety, comparison, over-preparation, or the constant sense that you're one misstep away from being exposed. This is the shadow contract many men unknowingly sign. I will succeed, achieve, and perform as long as I don't have to feel what was once unsafe to feel. The persona becomes competent, admired, and controlled, but the shadow keeps the ledger. Every compliment triggers pressure. Every success raises the stakes. Instead of dissolving insecurity, achievement often amplifies it, giving the alarm a louder microphone. There are signals of this dynamic that are easy to miss because they're socially rewarded. Hyper-preparation that goes far beyond what's necessary. Defensiveness when questioned, even gently. A subtle, moral superiority that functions like armor, protecting against the fear of being seen as insufficient. On the surface, these look like strength. Internally, they're often attempts to outrun an old threat that no longer exists, except in memory. Clinicians hear this pattern frequently. A high-status professional describes an unexpected wave of panic after praise. Not because the praise is unwanted, but because it activates a question the nervous system can't answer. Now that I'm seen, can I rest, or do I have to keep proving? The body answers before the mind has language. Tight chest, shallow breath, a sudden urge to prepare for the next evaluation. This isn't arrogance or fragility. It's a system trained in conditional safety. What's important here is not to turn this into another self-critique. The shadow is not an enemy. It's a record of adaptation. At some point, these strategies worked. They preserved connection. They reduced risk. But adaptation becomes limitation when it's no longer conscious. When the persona runs the show alone, insecurity becomes the shadow's way of knocking from the inside. If insecurity isn't weakness, the next question is darker and more honest. Who benefits from you staying insecure? Not in a conspiratorial sense, but structurally. What parts of your identity, your relationships, or your ambitions depend on you never quite feeling settled? Sometimes the system itself prefers vigilance to rest, because rest was never modeled as safe. Hold that question gently. There's no need to answer it yet. Don't skip ahead. 2 topics from now, this idea will be tested against a real trauma bond survivor account. For now, just notice how success and insecurity may have been living side by side, not as opposites, but as collaborators in a contract you never consciously agreed to. Insecurity rarely stays contained within the self. It looks for mirrors. When the inner signal feels overwhelming, the psyche searches for somewhere to place it. This is where relationships quietly become stages, not for intimacy, but for unresolved doubt. Jung called this projection, the act of assigning our own disowned feelings, fears, or unmet needs to someone else, often without realizing it. What feels like sharp perception is frequently an internal experience, looking for an external explanation. In relationships, this often takes a familiar form. Self-doubt gets outsourced onto partners, rivals, or authority figures. Their distance becomes proof. Their ambiguity becomes threat. Their independence becomes rejection. What's happening internally feels so convincing that it registers as intuition, a gut feeling, a warning. But many of these signals aren't about the present relationship at all. They're echoes of earlier dynamics, replayed through a new face. Attachment neurobiology helps explain why this pattern is so sticky. The nervous system doesn't seek truth first. It seeks regulation. Uncertainty creates dopamine spikes. Intense focus, pursuit, heightened meaning. Safety, by contrast, is regulated by oxytocin, which feels quieter, steadier, less dramatic. For a system conditioned in unpredictability, calm can feel suspicious, even boring. The body learns to confuse activation with aliveness, anxiety with connection. This is why insecurity often masquerades as insight. The mind builds narratives quickly. Something is off. I need to act. I need to secure this. But underneath the story is a memory loop, not a conscious one, but a somatic one. The body remembers what it was like to reach for connection and not know if it would be returned. That memory shapes perception long before logic has a chance to intervene. Across cultures, this dynamic has been romanticized. the unavailable muse, the distant beloved, the figure who must be pursued, earned, or deciphered. Western literature and Eastern romance narratives repeat this trope endlessly, not because it's healthy, but because it's familiar. It mirrors early attachment patterns where love felt conditional or intermittent. Insecurity finds these stories compelling because they validate its urgency. When rejection or loss of control enters the picture, the system reacts predictably. Pursuit intensifies. People-pleasing emerges as strategy, or resentment goes underground, expressed through withdrawal or quiet bitterness. None of these responses are moral failures. They're attempts at regulation. The nervous system is trying to restore equilibrium using the tools it learned early on. What makes this particularly difficult to see is that the relational focus feels justified. Attention stays on the other person, their behavior, their signals, their availability. Meanwhile, the internal state driving the reaction remains unexamined. Projection keeps the spotlight outward. As long as the threat appears external, the system doesn't have to confront its own history. But insecurity doesn't only distort relationships. Over time, it trains the nervous system to predict threat where none exists. Patterns become expectations. Expectations harden into identity. And without awareness, the same dynamics repeat across different relationships, different contexts, different stages of life, all wearing different disguises. This isn't about withdrawing from connection or dismissing relational pain. It's about recognizing that what feels relational is often physiological and historical at the same time. When that distinction begins to form, something subtle shifts. The experience is still intense, but it's no longer absolute. The alarm is still sounding, but it's starting to be recognized as an alarm. But insecurity doesn't stop at perception. It moves deeper. It embeds itself in the body's threat prediction systems, shaping reactions before thought even enters the room. That's where this exploration turns next, toward the nervous system itself, and why the mind alone has never been able to talk insecurity into silence. At a certain point, it becomes clear why insight alone hasn't been enough. Many men understand their patterns intellectually. They can name the wound, trace it to childhood, even explain it with precision. And yet, in the moment that matters, the body reacts first. The chest tightens, the breath shortens, certainty becomes urgent. This isn't a failure of will or intelligence. It's a clue about where the pattern actually lives. Insecurity is often driven by chronic sympathetic arousal, an activated nervous system that has learned to stay alert as a baseline. Over time, this state begins to feel like personality. Restlessness gets mistaken for ambition. Vigilance gets mistaken for discipline. Control gets mistaken for strength. But what's really happening is simpler and more humbling. The body learned that safety required readiness, and it never received the update that the threat had passed. Neuroscience gives language to this without stripping it of meaning. Neuroplasticity describes how threat circuits strengthen through repetition, not through logic. Each time uncertainty is met with alarm, the pathway deepens. The system becomes efficient at anticipating danger, even when danger is no longer present. This efficiency can look impressive on the surface. Quick thinking, foresight, preparedness. But it carries a cost. The body never stands down. Seen this way, insecurity isn't self-hatred. It's overlearned vigilance, a nervous system that became very good at scanning for rupture, disapproval, or abandonment. The intention was protective. The outcome over time is constricting. Life becomes something to manage rather than inhabit. Presence gets replaced by monitoring. Choice narrows into compulsion. This is why purely mental strategies tend to collapse under pressure. The mind may offer reassurance, but the body is already mobilized. By the time a thought appears, the physiology has made its decision. This isn't because the mind is weak, but because it isn't in charge of threat detection. That role belongs to older systems, shaped by repetition and reinforced by memory. There's a subtle moment many men recognize once they begin paying attention inwardly. Certainty-seeking spikes before conscious thought forms. An urge to check, to clarify, to secure an outcome appears almost reflexively. It feels immediate, unquestionable. This moment often passes unnoticed because it's so fast. But it's the hinge point, the instant where insecurity translates sensation into story. What's striking is how consistent this pattern appears across accounts. Trauma-informed therapists describe it clinically. Survivors describe it in their own language. Even anonymous narratives converge on the same experience. The body reacts first, the story comes second, and the sense of self adjusts around the reaction. Different lives, similar wiring. This realization marks a quiet midpoint, not because anything is solved, but because responsibility shifts. Insecurity is no longer treated as a character flaw to be argued with, nor as an enemy to be defeated. It becomes a state to be understood. A physiological pattern that once served a purpose and now asks for a different kind of relationship. This is where most advice collapses. Not because it's wrong, but because it's aimed at the wrong level. The next movement in this exploration looks at something closely related and often misunderstood: control. Not as discipline or leadership, but as a response to fear that has learned to disguise itself as strength. Control often enters the story disguised as virtue. It looks like discipline, foresight, responsibility. It's praised in leadership, rewarded in work, and quietly encouraged in men who learned early that staying composed meant staying safe. But beneath its polished surface, control frequently has a different origin. Not confidence, but fear that learned to organize itself. Jung spoke of archetypes not as characters, but as patterns of energy. One of the clearest contrasts here is between the tyrant and the king. The tyrant governs through rigidity, suspicion, and dominance. Order is imposed because inner order is missing. The king, by contrast, rules from internal coherence. Authority flows outward because it exists inwardly. Control without inner order breeds paranoia. Presence without control breeds trust. Many men confuse these two. They tighten routines, standards, and expectations, believing that if everything stays in line, they will finally feel settled. But the nervous system reads control differently. It doesn't experience it as safety. It experiences it as vigilance prolonged. The body stays braced, waiting for the moment control fails. And it always does, because life is not static. Philosophers noticed this long before neuroscience gave it language. Machiavelli is often misread as an advocate for domination, but beneath his analysis is a quieter warning. External control collapses without internal sovereignty. When authority depends entirely on force, manipulation, or anticipation, it becomes brittle. The same applies inwardly. A man who governs himself through constant pressure eventually fractures under the weight of it. There's a darker layer to this pattern that deserves careful attention. Gaslighting, whether imposed by others or internalized over time, trains men to distrust their own signals. When reality is repeatedly questioned or invalidated, the system compensates by tightening control. If perception can't be trusted, certainty must be manufactured. Over time, this creates a split. Sensation says one thing, strategy says another, and neither feels fully reliable. This split shows up in familiar cycles. Perfectionism on one end, procrastination on the other. Both are attempts to avoid the same discomfort. One tries to dominate it through flawlessness. The other escapes it through delay. Neither resolves the underlying fear. Both keep the system locked in anticipation, never quite arriving at rest. Studies of leadership across cultures reveal a similar pattern. Rigid authority performs well under stable conditions, but collapses under stress. Flexibility, attunement, and internal coherence predict resilience far more reliably than control. The nervous system mirrors this truth. Strength that relies on tension cannot adapt. Strength that emerges from regulation can. This is where many men feel a quiet grief. Control was supposed to be the answer. It brought temporary relief, structure, even success. Letting go of it can feel like stepping into chaos. But what begins to replace it is not passivity. It's something far less performative. A steadiness that doesn't need to announce itself. An authority that doesn't depend on constant vigilance. If control is fear trying to manage the future, what follows is not surrender, but discernment. Not collapse, but recalibration. The next movement in this exploration turns toward that quieter shift. The point where insecurity begins to lose leverage. Not because it's fought, but because it's no longer mistaken for command. There is a belief that often lives beneath insecurity, rarely spoken aloud, because it sounds too stark when named. If I don't anticipate rejection, I'll be destroyed by it. This belief doesn't arrive as a sentence. It arrives as posture, breath, and readiness. It shapes how the nervous system scans the future, always slightly ahead of the present moment. always preparing for impact. When this belief is operating, insecurity feels necessary, useful even. It seems to offer protection through anticipation. If the threat is seen early enough, maybe it can be managed. Maybe it can be softened. Maybe the pain can be outrun. The system doesn't experience this as anxiety. It experiences it as responsibility. Viktor Frankl offered a different framing that becomes important here. Between stimulus and identity, there is space. Not a dramatic gap, not a philosophical abstraction, but a lived pause where meaning is formed. In that space, a sensation does not automatically become a definition of self. A reaction does not have to harden into a story about who you are. This space is subtle, and it can't be forced. It appears when observation replaces negotiation. This is the pivot point. Insecurity begins to lose its leverage not when it's challenged, argued with, or replaced by confidence, but when it's observed without being obeyed. The sensation still arises. The tightening still happens, but it no longer dictates action or identity. The alarm is heard, but it isn't handed the keys. Something changes in the emotional texture at this stage. Shame behaves differently. Instead of escalating into urgency or self-attack, it softens. It moves through the body without demanding performance. There's less compulsion to explain, justify, or prove. The experience remains uncomfortable, but it's no longer catastrophic. It becomes tolerable, then informative. Men who exit trauma bonds often describe this shift in understated language. One day, the familiar spike appears, but it doesn't pull them forward or collapse them inward. The insecurity is still present, but it feels informational, not commanding. It points to a tender place without forcing a reaction. For the first time, the system registers that discomfort does not equal danger. What's happening here isn't detachment or numbness, it's discernment. The nervous system begins updating its predictions. The old rule, anticipate or be destroyed, loses its authority because lived experience contradicts it. Rejection, uncertainty, or disapproval may still hurt, but they no longer annihilate identity. The body learns this slowly, through repetition, not through insight alone. What began as threat detection ends as discernment. The same sensitivity that once fueled insecurity becomes a capacity for nuance. Signals are read without panic. Sensations are felt without immediate action. The loop that once fed itself begins to close, not with force, but with accuracy. By this point, insecurity no longer needs to be framed as an enemy or a flaw. Seen clearly, it functions more like a compass needle than a verdict. It moves, it reacts, it responds to internal and external shifts. The trouble only begins when its movement is mistaken for truth about who you are or what must be done. When that confusion softens, insecurity returns to its original role. Information, not command. This is where integration matters more than elimination. Jung was precise about this. What is acknowledged loses its coercive power. What is denied operates from the dark. The shadow doesn't dissolve when it's attacked. It relaxes when it's recognized. Insecurity, when met with awareness rather than resistance, stops hijacking behavior. It becomes one signal among many, not the voice in charge. The payoff of this shift is subtle but profound. Choice returns where compulsion once ruled. Presence becomes possible where anticipation dominated. Decisions are made closer to the present moment, informed by sensation rather than driven by fear. The nervous system, no longer forced to stay on guard, begins to recalibrate its sense of threat and safety. Life feels less like a test and more like a process you can actually inhabit. There is a single analogy that captures this transition well. It's like learning that thunder isn't an attack, but feedback from the atmosphere. The sound is still loud. The vibration still moves through the body, but it no longer signals danger. It becomes part of the environment, something to register without needing to defend against. When insecurity stops running the room, it doesn't disappear. It changes function. What once demanded certainty now offers discernment. What once narrowed options now highlights values. The alarm becomes an instrument, and with that shift, authority over your inner life quietly returns. If this mapped something familiar, there's value in marking it. Not for performance, but for recognition. A single moment, remembered or recent, when insecurity loosened its grip and choice reappeared, often helps others recognize the same opening in themselves.